Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from PJ Harvey called The Hope 6 Demolition Project. You know, it's gotten to the point of cliche that I open up reviews from long-respected, critically acclaimed artists that I've never covered before with the assertion that it's hard to talk about legends. And yet, the more I've thought about that assertion, the less it makes any sort of sense. Presuming, of course, that I'm respectful and I do my homework, it shouldn't be any more or less difficult to talk about these acts. And on some level, I wouldn't call re-listening through a discography work, especially when it's as good as PJ Harvey's is. Most well known for a series of absolutely fantastic albums in the 90s and affiliated with Nick Cave, there's a lot of overlap in touring personnel and producers between them. English singer-songwriter PJ Harvey's always been one of those artists, for me, where the critically acclaimed discography has been a little bit daunting to tackle in full. But over the course of the past several weeks, I've listened through every single album and I found a lot that I really like. A voice that can span delicate coos to full-throated howls, compositions that twist melodies and grooves in intricate, interesting ways that still manage to be catchy as hell, production that preserves a ton of brittle, razor-edge texture that adds to the intimacy and intensifies the rawness, and songwriting that tends to be kind of tricky to decode, but often reveals vivid storytelling with an emotive core that might seem a bit abstract at points, but no less powerful. Now, in terms of her recorded output, many would agree that her alternative rock side in the mid-early 90s was her best work, with the bid for mainstream appeal on Stories from the City, Stories from the Sea signaling the end of it. At least for me, that record really hasn't held up well. The next several years would have her dipping back into explosive rawness on Her in 2004, a stab at gothic pianos on White Chalk in 2007, but where things really kicked back into gear came in 2011 with Let England Shake, pulling in a broader instrumental palette of auto harp, zither, horns, and her highest vocal register yet to juxtapose against some truly shocking and graphic lyrics delving into the violence of war. It's a genuinely unsettling record, especially considering how damn catchy it was, and it reflects one of the first times that PJ Harvey has directly delved into political material, and it would not be her last. In 2015, she recorded her newest album live through one-way glass in an exhibit open to the public. They could all see her, she couldn't see them. And with the title of the Hope 6 Demolition Project, it's clear that she was turning her target to the modern era and to the United States at the very least. So, how did that all turn out? Well, here's the thing. This is a record that the more I thought about it, the more I both liked and disliked it. On the surface, the contemporary politics of the album had good intentions and seemed to follow a solid through line, but digging into the details, you encounter a lot of places where the nuance seems strangely missing, showing a lack of self-awareness that made much of the social commentary kind of clunky at best and seriously off-color at worst. But you go deeper than that, and you realize that might be part of the point, a subversion of this sort of voyeuristic social commentary that was directly mirrored in the way that the album was constructed in the first place. All this means that the Hope 6 Demolition Project has a lot of layers to it, but I'm not quite certain they add up to nearly as much as they might imply, which definitely makes this something of a frustrating listen. And unfortunately, I wouldn't say this is one of PJ Harvey's best works, at least not in the upper tier of her really great albums. So before we start delving into the layers of this project, I feel it's necessary to lay some groundwork regarding the titular project on this album. Hope 6 was a project put forward by the United States government in order to replace substandard public housing with mixed income developments in order to bring things back together, revitalize certain areas. And yet the program has been something of a mess, right, with prioritization of private firms over public development, the city's utilizing it as a method to raise property values and taxes instead of the actual state of the housing projects, and worst yet, no one-to-one replacement policy, which means that in the process of redevelopment, there's no guarantee that poor families that once lived there won't be displaced permanently, or forced out by higher rent in the gentrified area that they can't afford. And yet, in reality, while PJ Harvey does take aim at this topic on songs like Community of Hope, her focus is broader and seeks to endemic poverty and destabilize communities on a larger scale, with a specific focus on Kosovo and Afghanistan. And it's about this time for me to reestablish my guidelines for good political art. The 3 Ps: power, precision, populism. In other words, the best politically themed art for me can strike real impact, can understand its targets and approach the situation with nuance, and simultaneously can speak to a human perspective larger than oneself. The best art in this vein that hits all 3 Ps and tends to be pretty awesome, but you can get away with 2 if the music is good enough. But is it in this case? This record shares a fair bit in common with Let England Shake and its greater usage of horns to balance out against the rattling guitars, but this time around, instead of cultivating more of an airy vibrancy to balance against the content, the brass is much thicker darker and heavier, more inspired by blues, often mixing in with a sharper snares to create more of an old school big band vibe even, which does make a certain amount of sense given the touches of Americana that run through this album. But this choice means that much of the danger of this record and the more ragged, rough-edged guitars that are normally at the front that sizzle and spark feels sucked back a bit, almost feeling a little bit too garish in the horns, a little bit too slick to really encapsulate the danger and unspoken urgency in this content. I mean, there are a few points that get close. The staccato riffing of the Ministry of Defense, the faded rattle of a line in the sand with the bouncy horns and the drum groove that feeds to an oddly captivating hook. But PJ Harvey stepping into the highest reaches of her range, she really sounds quite beautiful there. The bluesy minimalism of River Anacostia that builds some potent smoked out swell that I really liked. One of the few songs that has enough room to breathe. A lot of these tracks are really quite short. They don't really develop a lot either. The textured percussion that builds to a solid ascension on the Orange Monkey, especially melodically, and the horns and hand claps driving the squonking melody of the wheel. But those horns, they also got their cringeworthy moments, like on Near the Memorials of Vietnam and Lincoln, where I really dug the subtle piano touch on the first part of the verse before that god-awful compressed horn feed blared over the rest of it. Or take the extended outro on the Ministry of Social Affairs. I mean, I appreciate the ragged nature of the soloing on the horns, but without a lot of the structure, it feels a little bit garish and overstated, not playing to any of the song's strengths or the grooves. But then again, considering how overmixed and blended so much of the album feels in its instrumental textures, it's rare when one instrumental element or one instrument can actually stand out, outside of the horns, of course, kind of run over everything. And sure, of course PJ Harvey's vocals, they're gonna sound good. I've accepted the fact she's not gonna be as raw as she was in the past, and for what this album's trying to do, I can mostly appreciate playing much of this material straight instead of with her typical sense of humor. What gets kind of distracting is how often she's overtaken by her male backing chorus, or the instrumentation itself. And sure, it can lead to a choral effect that can kind of work for the populism. A narco-punk band Chumbawamba did much of the same thing in their 30-year history. A comparison that between the catchy hooks, the male-female dichotomy, the horns, the political strokes, it kind of seems apropos when the more you think about it. But where things get kind of dicey in that comparison comes in the content and the presentation. PJ Harvey's always been a writer with a knack for creating very vivid pictures with her words, even if they are kind of abstract, and that's just as true here. The abandoned buildings on the Ministry of Defense, the polluted waters of River Anacostia, and perhaps the most jarring moment of kind of poor taste on medicinals, a homeless Native American woman drinking booze and wearing a Washington Redskins cap. Now look, I get the image, and I get the message of desperate poverty underneath it, but by playing to the broadest possible caricature in order to make her point, and rarely ever placing herself in the same frame, it rings to the sort of shock tactic that you think PJ Harvey would be above at this point in her career. And this problem, this poverty tourism as some critics have coined it, it's consistent across the majority of this album, almost to the point where you would argue that it's kind of intentional. And I would argue that PJ Harvey does indeed recognize that. It's where the themes of this album seem to shift a little bit. Less political messaging and more about how that political message is presented. I mean, there are running metaphors of distance between herself and the audience on tracks like A Line in the Sand, or the taunting child of Near the Memorials of Vietnam and Lincoln, or the bankers sitting by their locked glass cabinets on the Ministry of Social Affairs, or the faded photographs of the tragedies on the wheel, or hell, all of Community of Hope hoping on the Hope 6 demolition project itself. Hell, on the final song, Dollar Dollar, PJ Harvey is approached by a child in Afghanistan when she's in traffic. That child's asking for $1, and separated only by the glass in her car, PJ Harvey's left speechless. For someone who has privilege to encounter extreme poverty like this, it leaves them kind of paralyzed. The evocative power, that stark moment so outside of their own experience, that gulf in their experiences. And you go even further to how PJ Harvey made this project behind one-way glass where everyone else could see her but she couldn't see them. That's tourism in the artistic process, but never that direct connection. There is that gulf between them. Now, there are definitely issues with this thesis the more you think about it. For one, if PJ Harvey wanted to make a point about poverty tourism and the mental barricades that we build in order to ignore the disenfranchisement of others, maybe it would have been better if she didn't rely on such blatant stereotypes to make that point, even if those stereotypes are pretty vivid and well painted. But the larger issue comes in the presentation, because of the lack of greater texture in her instrumentation, she misses the opportunity for a sharper edge in her message, for the music to mirror the content. And by surrounding her voice amidst a crowd of backing vocals, it's a further distancing effect from her and her audience, to who she's targeting. Kind of ironic given the themes. Now this hurts both the precision and the populism of her political statements, and the fact that she's co-opting real geopolitical nightmares going on right now in order to make a point about her messaging, that just feels kind of cheap to me if I'm being honest. And while I would never ask PJ Harvey to provide solutions to these problems, for her themes to work, awareness kind of is sufficient, but I do feel this album's theme itself can run a little thin. It makes a point about the shock to the system, but there's no progression beyond it, just stasis and paralysis from behind the glass. So look, in short, again, I'm really conflicted about this album. I appreciate the thematic layers, and most of the execution does kind of click for me, but a lot of the music itself leaves me feeling kind of cold. It just feels kind of abortive. Not enough songs have enough progression to really get there for me. At least when Chumbawamba blended their politics with hook-driven tracks, they had a stronger sense of wry humor and populism. Whereas this album is a lot more austere and dusty, more focused on its message and catchy almost by accident. As such, for me, I'm feeling a light 6 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore fan of PJ Harvey. But frankly, if I'm being honest, she's done a lot better. I think this album could have worked if she took the chance to get a little bit more personal and frame herself as part of the situation, show more of that dichotomy. As it is, we've got a lot of stark moments, but many are blurry, faded, and locked in glass cases. And that's not the way you want to experience that shock. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this review might be a little bit contentious, so I've got the poll up here. What did you guys think of this album? Did it manage to click for you, or am I just overthinking things again? Beyond that, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.